Frontline workers keep our world moving. They work in high-stakes, fast-changing environments where technology can empower them or hold them back. And when adoption fails, the impact ripples outward, slowing teams, frustrating customers, and undermining the success of the entire organization. This is Frontline Innovators, and I'm your host, Justin Lake. In each episode, I speak with leaders who are rethinking how technology is introduced, embraced, and sustained on the front line. Leaders putting people at the heart of digital transformation. Frontline Innovators is brought to you by Skillful. We help organizations achieve lasting technology adoption for frontline teams so they can work smarter, safer, and with confidence in the tools they use every day. Welcome to Frontline Innovators Podcast. I'm your host, Justin Lake, and today I'm welcoming back Julie Whitten, who first joined me on episode 122 back in, believe it or not, January of 2024. Julie is a transformation leader who has spent decades in the messy middle of large-scale change where strategy meets the front line. And since our last conversation, she's channeled that experience into a new book, The People Stack: Why Change Fails and What Actually Fixes It. It tackles one of the most stubborn problems in our industry, the gap between what gets built and what actually gets adopted in the field, making it very relevant to the conversations here on Frontline Innovators. Julie, welcome back to the show. I'm so glad you're here.
Thank you. Happy to be back.
So we've changed things up a little bit since January of 2024. And we haven't changed our compassion for the men and women on the front lines, but we have reoriented a little bit to think about kind of the business impact of poor adoption. And so my question to you now is different than what it was back in 2024. My question is, what's the biggest operational consequence of poor frontline technology adoption?
It's a great question, Justin. Thank you so much. I could go in so many different directions, but I come back to why do we do change management in the first place? And for me, it's really twofold. It's the right thing to do, as you alluded to earlier, and it's to get to that adoption state faster. And I think when we begin to think about adoption and we think about projects and initiatives and return on investment that we're going to have for making the investments, whether it's technology or transformation or even culture or M&A, it's almost assumed that it's going to reach 100% adoption. I feel like it's the thing that people don't talk about. And it's not, when the decision is made by the organization to make that investment, that's not even at the starting line yet, right? To realize that investment, to realize that ROI. So I do think it's really thinking about, and that's kind of the gap that I'm talking about in the book. How do we get to that adoption state faster? How do we not assume that it's going to be 100% and really take the time to understand the different layers of things that need to happen for it to go well?
Yeah, I agree with everything you just said. And before we get into perhaps ways to think about the solutions, I really want to dig in a little bit deeper to the source, like the root cause of the problem, because it still baffles me the number of conversations that we have about the unlikely scenario that things are going to be adopted quickly. Most of us that have been around projects, we know that it's going to be a problem. And yet something that you said is true. And I actually have data to support this. You said that once the project is decided, then the assumption is that adoption is going to happen. And I actually hosted a bit of a focus group with senior leaders in service operations. So they had a lot of frontline workers. And one of the questions was about the thoughts that they have when they're contemplating a technology deployment. And one of the things that was interesting is ROI of the technology almost had no respondents. And it literally caused us like scratch our heads. We were like, wait a second, this should be maybe top of the list. What was interesting to me is that they shifted thinking over to business disruption, or said more positively, business continuity, right? Like, how do they keep things going during this change? So they had made the decision to implement new technology. They kind of assumed that they were going to get the ROI that they predicted when they put the business case together. So that those are like check boxes were checked. And now they were kind of back to like working in the business to say, okay, how do we still service our customers? How do we do the deliveries? How do we do all the other things that we have to do? And that makes sense for operations leaders. Like I get that because that's how they're wired to think. But it was interesting how few people. Now it was a small sample size. It was 20 something people, but it was interesting. Like I think it was zero respondents that were concerned about that. And so it was such a head scratcher for us. So why do you think that is? Why do you think that despite all the data to the contrary, people still enter into each of these new engagements as if adoption is a given?
Yeah, well, first, I'm sitting over here laughing, right? Because the behavior that those leaders have while they were going through a change, what did they do? They went back to their comfort zone. They went back to what
Yes.
was familiar, right? So that is like, it's
There's
so
irony in what you just said, isn't there?
yeah, yeah, I mean, just I had to laugh when you said that, but it's so true. We're and listen, we're wired to be like this, so this is a no judgment zone. Some of the things that I found, and this is why I really wanted to write about it, is there's kind of like this invisible human operating system that lies underneath all projects and initiatives, and that's what I'm calling the people stack. And there's different layers. So that I think and I found in my experience that need to be true in order for adoption to accelerate and to be successful. The first one is clarity. And it sounds super simple, but if the leaders don't have clarity amongst themselves and also kind of the clarity for the greater organization of what's happening, it can be detrimental, and I can't tell you how many times I've been asked to support a project or initiative where it's really not 100% clear what is the absolute change we're gonna make, why are we making it? It sounds so simple, right? But that's why, products and initiative fails. Number one reason is that why but there's not always that deeper dive, Justin, into why for the organization versus why for the individual. So clarity is kind of the foundation. And then from there, I find alignment is the next one up. And it's not only alignment across leaders, which I know we've all been in those meetings where leaders are all saying, yes, yes, yes. And then they leave and everybody's going their different ways or somebody's kind of avoiding it. And then across and down the organization alignment as well. And then there's the capability piece, which most people equate to training, which it is, and the ability to practice the training, right? And a lot of times there's a real gap there between time and space given to practice whatever that new way of working might be. And or I've seen the training come way too far ahead of when the actual go live is. So by that time, people have forgotten to do it. So there's this notion of, actually being able to do what's needed, but also the time poor piece, and not giving that time and space, and that's a place where, leadership is really needed to develop that capability that is needed to be successful. The next one up is belief. So do they have the affinity to follow whatever they're doing? And it's bigger than just desire, in my opinion. Do they actually believe in the change? And then the last one is probably no surprise sustainment. So do they move on to the next thing or are they able to sustain and embed whatever they're trying to do in culture? And then with those 5 layers, trust is really foundational to each one of those. So you can kind of see where change and adoption can quietly break within those different layers. And that's kind of what I've found over my experience.
So much to unpack there. First of all, I love your mention of trust being foundational across the board. This comes up a lot on the show and it comes up a lot in my conversations outside the podcast where I think one of the things that is free to do, doesn't cost extra money, but it does take some thought is building a culture of trust. And the thought behind that, you can't just like implement trust. I think the way that you earn trust is through transparent conversation with people, right? And telling people what's going to happen, following through on the commitments, right? Admitting, I think maybe one of the best things we can do is admitting when things haven't gone right and not trying to suggest that everything was good, right? When we know it wasn't, maybe a past project or something like that. So I think there are so many things there that don't actually have to cost a lot of time or money, but they enable all of the other things to become effective, right? And I think I love that you've called that out as foundational to all those other elements.
Yeah, 100%. So, first part of the book is all around the layers that I just talked about. The second bit is how do you activate on them? And I talk a lot about that trust piece. how it can be very challenging if you're operating in an environment where it's fragile to begin with, or there's a history of leadership turnover or failed implementations. Really, really, really challenging. And how do you build trust? You build it by doing what you say you're going to do. And that proof to get that belief that we were talking about, that takes time, right? And I also talk about the trust appears differently. We've got 5 generations in the workplace right now, and that trust means different things to different people. So, yeah, it's complicated is the best way I'll describe it, but foundational to the work that needs to be done.
Talk to me a little bit more about the 5 generations and trust. It almost maybe seems a little bit counterintuitive, like trust would just be kind of a universal human characteristic, right? Or perception. We either have it or we don't, and maybe it's personalized down to the individual. But I haven't heard anybody say that it's different by generation. Talk me through that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, again, 5 generations in the workplace, and you think about kind of where the world is today, but for the baby boomers, trust was a handshake, right? Like, and it's not that anymore. People don't even operate in the same work in the same places a lot of the times, because we live in a society of instant gratification. So trust is built more differently with your millennial workforce, right? But I think it's just about thinking about what do your demographics look like, and then what do they need to hear? How do they need to hear the message? Does it come across in different ways? How can you build a coalition or a champion network for to help with that belief or affinity with different segments of the audience that when you look at it by different generations. So I just think that those are dimensions when you do exercises like stakeholder assessment for change implementation. People don't think about those types of dimensions. They kind of go down by rank of the organization. And I always challenge people to look at it a little bit differently and think about where the resistance is going to be from that generational standpoint. And then when you think later on like technology, I think this is kind of coming together when you think about different generations, how they adopt technology and why trust is, how can you earn their trust? And that's some of the questions that you ask, and that formulates all of your change plan. I really feel like that stakeholder assessment, if you do it right, is the key to getting the plan right.
When I hear people talk about this very personalized approach of really thinking about the different user profiles in the organization, something that always keeps kind of gnawing at me is, I always talk, I lead a fairly small organization. There's less than 2 dozen of us. So doing things with personalization in an organization of our size, I mean, it might even be difficult with us, but because we're not all co-located. But at the end of the day, there's less than 20 people in an organization that has hundreds or thousands of people. That ability to personalize seems like it would be almost impossible at scale. How do you think now? Again, I know we were not saying we're going to have an independent conversation with every individual, but how do we apply that kind of individuality when we know that we can't do what I just said? We can't have a conversation with each person.
Yeah, it's a fine line too, and I think, depending upon the size of the organization, will give you some constraints. But I think this is where, when you think about sponsorship, executive sponsorship, and that's the number 2 reasons that project initiatives fail or succeed. Um, that's a real opportunity to humanize leaders, right? And we know, senior leaders in the C-suite are extremely busy folks that don't. They're time poor. We talked about time poor earlier, but what are the right touch points that they need to be present for, right? And that's something that can be part of the change strategy. They should probably have an individualized plan, um, where they need to be present. And I think they need to be humanized. So, if you've got people of different generations that are part of that leadership team, like you could see kind of where this is all leading. So I don't know that you can't, boil the ocean and do everything, but how are you going to be strategic and intentional about having them be present at the right touch points, and whether that's, sitting in on a frontline focus group or that sort of thing, or kicking off certain things, or just helping people to understand that they're a real person, because leaders are people too. And I think sometimes teams tend to forget that they're under a tremendous amount of pressure.
Yeah, I think that's a fair point. And, you said something when we opened this conversation that I know we kind of chuckled about it, but I find myself reflecting back on just whatever that was 12 minutes ago or something about how, yes, they're people too. The leaders in the business are people too. And they also have a comfort zone. That was the part that you mentioned that I thought was interesting because I don't think that we think about that very often. And I think you may have just unlocked one of the keys that I've been trying to figure out through this podcast and outside this podcast is what's the way that we can communicate with senior leaders in the business about the way that their frontline workers are likely feeling some of this change in a way that resonates with those leaders. Because you talked about senior leaders being time poor. The frontline workers that we're trying to serve are also time poor. And it's not even their choice that they're time poor. They're
Right.
time poor because we're literally judging their performance based on their utilization or their billable hours or the number of deliveries or the number of service calls, like whatever it is, we're judging literally their performance based on that. And any time spent not performing against their objectives is taking away from their ability to perform. And so, what you talked about earlier is a bit of an unlock because I think the senior leaders, if we can say to them, you know how you have that feeling of wanting to get back to your comfort zone of focusing, controlling the things that you can control. That's exactly what your frontline team members are trying to do. They know how to do those deliveries. They know how to service that equipment. They know how to service the customer. They know how to do those things. And so you're injecting all of this change into this process here. And they have this muscle memory that they just want to go back to what they know and how to perform. And I wonder if we can do a better job of drawing that out with the senior leaders to say, that way you're feeling, that's the way that they're feeling. That's what we've been trying to tell you. Right.
It's such
I
a
don't know.
great
Have you
parallel.
have you figured out how to have this conversation in an effective way? I think you probably have.
Well, I don't know about that, but I mean, I could share what I've experienced, right? And one of the things when I begin to coach senior leaders just about big initiatives, and it's usually in the context of them being a sponsor, we tend to have conversations about how they show up as an individual in the face of change. And we talk about, that resistance is natural for every human being, which is in a sense what we're talking about really is resistance and, different types of archetypes. And then try to ground it in why is that happening? Why do you present yourself with that behavior? Why would somebody else on your frontline team do it the way? There's a reason that they're acting that way. So I think if there's this aha moment and when you start to educate them a little bit, if they have the appetite for it, you also asked a question about how do you speak their language and kind of bring in kind of what's happening on the ground to them, right? Because they can't be everywhere. And I found it's best to have quantitative and qualitative data to show them because leaders are numbers people from the for the most part, right? They're um, and they want to see kind of where their employees are, but we can do that with some data, and then I think we can show and tell the data story with the actual sound bites. And great if you can get somebody to spend some time in one of those sessions. I've had real luck in doing that, where the leader's eyes are really open to say, oh my gosh, my people really wanna do what I'm asking them to do. I have to remove some barriers that they're having. I didn't even realize we had those barriers. The closer that you can bring them in, the better success you will have.
Service Council actually has data to support what you just said. There's two sides of that, which is first, the teams in the field. This is field service specific at Service Council, so it doesn't represent other frontline worker populations. But I would bet that this is, probably would carry over to some of those other user profiles as well. One of the things that they found in their research, I don't remember the numbers here, but I can get those numbers later. But that the majority of those frontline team members in field service actually are open to and excited about adopting new technologies and processes. The challenge for them is the time constraint, right? They are not granted the time to absorb the change. And I have a recent anecdote with a company, 5,000 technicians around the world. They actually made the changes that were actually requested by the field service engineers. And then they deployed those changes and it didn't get adopted correctly. And that was frustrating for the team that invested all the time and money to learn about the change requests, to go do all the heavy lifting of implementing them, and then to have it essentially kind of thrown back in their face by poor adoption in the field. But they hadn't really given them the mechanism to do something that you said before, which is not to just tell them about it, but to let them practice and to gauge their readiness before they actually went live in this. So even though it was something that they wanted and had asked for, they weren't really ready for the change.
Yeah, that's where that readiness part of the change process is so important, Justin. But it's, I don't know, again, sometimes it's done in a vacuum, right? And these projects and initiatives are built kind of, just in the leadership ivory tower. I guess I'll just say it, and
Yeah.
and they're not grounded in reality, right? So, I mean, I'll be honest with you. I've even had project teams that, I've said, don't you want to go talk to the frontline employees that are going to be catching and receiving this and see what they think and how they, and it's they say no, and we can't do that. We can't. It would be a can of worms we're opening up, and it really, I've learned it's fear, right? Fear of kind of, oh my goodness, we're going to go outside of scope if we let them in, but what are the repercussions of not doing that is what you just said, right? So, yeah, huge opportunity. I'll say it positively.
Well, not to make this a plug for Skillful, but we actually have like an entire concept around our entire platform is the ability to objectively assess readiness of the users before go live. And what is interesting is almost every one of our customers has been a second time technology deployer, meaning they tried to do it once without a solution like ours in place and struggled because they didn't have a way to measure readiness. And so it's not everybody's going to become a customer of Skillful, but you should have some mechanism in place to assess that. And you should put that discipline in place with or without a technology platform. I think it's interesting to hear you talk about the fear and this idea of opening up a can of worms, because what happens is the can of worms is going to get opened. Do you want it to get opened before or after go live? Like I don't it,
100%.
it's hard to imagine a scenario where you'd say, well, I'd rather stick my head in the sand until the big go live day and let's push the button and then just let's learn all the things that we didn't know that day. And
Yeah.
now it's customer impacting, it's operations impacting. This example I was talking about before, the customer talked a lot about the impact just to their help desk alone. Their help desk, their vendors, the software vendors help desk lit up for the first couple of weeks. Like they had call volume beyond what they could handle. And
Wow.
so that's like a real tangible way to feel that pain. But while people are on the phone with the help desk or sending emails to the help desk, they're not servicing the customer. So how many customers are impacted by those things at the same time? So I love the can of worms. Like it's going to get opened one way or another. Do you want to do this before and have a remediation plan, or do you want to do this after when now it's too late and you're scrambling?
It is such a hard lesson to learn because I just think, again, we live in this society of instant gratification. There's not always the patience. Oh, and I really think, again, it stems from fear. This will slow us down, right? If we have to do
Yes.
this. And it's really going to cause rework in the future. It's such a shame, but I feel like the leaders that really believe in change management are the people that have failed at doing that, and they know those repercussions, and they know what they wanna do right this time.
Yeah. So I this would actually be interesting to get your take on this. Like, you talk about readiness outside of a platform like ours. Maybe educate me without a platform uh, that does this stuff. What how do you assess readiness? And you also talked
Yeah.
about practice. And so I'm going to kind of bring those questions together a little bit. Maybe we could talk about that journey of enabling practice time and having the technical ability to provide a practice environment for the users and things like that, and then gauging readiness. Like, tell me about how you would recommend somebody, if somebody's about to launch a new project right now, how would you recommend they do this?
Yeah, it's a lot. I mean, very first step is change management should be involved from the beginning of that process, right? A lot of times that discipline is brought in way too late, and you don't have the the ability to do that readiness exercise. And it's interesting, like it depends on what type of project and the complexity and the scope, right? But I was just working on an ERP change, and there were several manufacturing plants. So, addition to kind of like this overarching corporate understanding of the overall culture and that readiness assessment, you have to look at the individual site assessment as well, right? So it's a series, and there's different frameworks and methodologies. We use different tools, but they're kind of all the same. They're looking at kind of the health of the organization, the people side of things. They're looking at the leadership and sponsorship, right? And just asking a series of questions to make sure that you're ready for this. But I do think that those things need to be done on multiple different scales, especially if it's a complex transformation. And sometimes when those things come back and there are glaring, I'll say opportunities, I'll say it positively, um, they're tough conversations because sometimes the leaders don't wanna hear about that, but it's back to that can of worms thing, right? Do you wanna know about this? Like, you have a problem over here right now, or do you wanna fix it after we try to layer whatever this complex initiative is? And there's trade-offs to both. So from there, I think there's a series of kind of, okay, what did we learn? And then thinking about that project plan and how does the people side of things, that invisible operating system I talked about, line up with the milestones of the project. And then asking some, again, hard questions. Are those realistic if we want to give people the opportunity to practice what they learned and make sure that the technology is operating correctly? Because I don't know how many that you've been a part of, Justin, or heard of that, they start to roll out the technology and there's something that's broken or something that does, it's clunky. And what happens, back to trust, right? Something like that happens, it erodes trust, and people go all the way back to that beginning of the emotional journey that they need to travel to get to acceptance, which gets you your adoption. Um, so yeah, I mean, it's really interesting. I think there's an art and a science to figuring all of that out and lots of complex details. But at the end of the day, I don't think that we're being realistic with the amount of time we're giving if we want to have the adoption that we want.
I wish we could make that case more strongly. Listen, I've never been an operational leader for, a national or global field service organization. So I can't even imagine uh, the pressure that they're under to execute. They never have enough resources. All of the constraints that just exist on their time. And, margins are pressured. They've got competitors who are trying to do the same service for less money. Like all those things are fighting. And then, we can come in, people like us, and say, kind of this idealistic, thing that says, hey, you really need to carve out some more time for your team to absorb this change. And that's just going to sound like the most ridiculous abstract thing to somebody who's grinding, trying to get 20,000 work orders or 10,000 deliveries done in a day with too few people, right? Too few trucks, too few of everything.
I mean, you're absolutely right. We see it everywhere. And what I've really found is it goes back to the top of the prioritization and competing priorities. Because I do really feel like a good leader can freeze and unfreeze the organization at any time when it comes to change, and the pacing is important, and lots of things are important, right? But what I don't see organizations do well is prioritize those different projects and initiatives to be able to grant that time. I think people just lose their patience at going through those exercises, but it is so important because you can't have all these things happening at the same time and be expected to service your customers. It's too much, right? So what can you do? What's the most important? Not saying that you can't do these other things, but you gotta pace them, right? So yeah, that's important work that I don't see being done, but is very needed.
Yeah. Well, you also mentioned earlier, you can't bring change strategy in the 11th hour. It's not exactly the way that you said it, but that's essentially what you were saying. And I do think that that happens often also, that maybe when things are seen to go off the rails, or maybe a lot of things have been done from the technology, like the technical implementation part of things. It's like, okay, this is going to start affecting the end users now. So now we bring in the OCM team or whatever. When we talk about time, one of the things you're making me realize is that if we wait until then to think about change strategy and what we're going to implement, we've missed an opportunity to include all of that in the budgeting, because that budget was set a year or 24 months ago there's probably an argument to be said, if the software that we're implementing is going to cost $10 million and there's going to be a $3 million implementation fee or whatever the crazy numbers are, or add zeros to all those numbers, whatever it is, right? There should be budget for lack of productivity, but like it should be intentional. We should go into this knowing that we're either going to need to pay overtime or we're not going to get as many deliveries done. So, how do we figure that out? We're going to need to overstaff in certain areas to make up for the fact that our people are going to be 20% less productive. The time to consider all of those things was probably before we funded the project
Yes.
so that it could be incorporated into this overall budget. And I haven't seen an example of where that's happened. And so what happens is then in the 11th hour, it's like, okay, now all the users that are going to be impacted by this, we got to figure this out. And so we are not granted the time and the budget, training, all of the things that happen to actually do this successfully. And to what we talked about, the operations leaders are going to fall back into their comfort zone and they're just going to try to pull the levers and push the switches that they know how to operate.
Yeah, yeah, and that's probably not sustainable in most cases. Um, I always say, and I just wrote an article about this, leaders live in the future, but our teams live in the present, right? So even though they've known about this for a while and they've been working towards that decision kind of behind the scenes, um, a lot of times when we start to flip the switch on something or just right before, that could be the first time that our teams are hearing about that, right? And that's not the right thing to do. So I do think, a seasoned project manager or systems integrator would be more helpful in that pre-planning that's needed, that preparation phase, for a change to go well.
That's interesting. You just reminded me when you talk about systems integrators. I have what's now amounting to a bit of a game that I play when I meet SIs at conferences and stuff like that. And the game goes something like this. I talk to them about their practice and the types of solutions that they're implementing. And then I lead them down a path of saying, well, tell me what your firm does for end user adoption. Like, how do you guys think about that? And I think it's either 100% or close to 100%. They say, oh, well, what we do is we train the trainer. We help support our customers and we train their trainers to then go and help with the adoption across the business. I said, that's great. How well does that work? 100% of the respondents that I have talked to say it doesn't work. And then I say, well, why do you keep doing it? This is like a Groundhog Day conversation. It's almost comical. I should start recording these things. I should do this on. This would probably make a good podcast episode. And so every time they say, well, the customer's budget really, it can't quite swing that. When we're going in and proposing our implementation services, their budget may not have, enough room for a really well thought out adoption plan. If you really peel back what these folks are saying, and I'm not disputing, I'm sure they're speaking truth. They might price themselves out of the deal, right? Okay,
Yeah.
I get it. But it's like we all float this number around that says 70% of digital transformations fail. Like everybody talks about the number. It's like it's the universal truth. Is there any question why they fail if we keep doing things that we know don't work and we keep saying, well, that's going to be our strategy? Like we're entering into this knowing that there's a 70% chance it's not going to be successful. I just can't think like if we were building bridges and we knew that there was a 70% chance the bridge was going to fall, like we would go back to the engineering team and say, but we probably need to figure out another plan here. But
Yeah.
we keep doing this over and over. And by the way, I'm talking about some of the largest consulting companies. Everybody knows the proper names. I'm talking about small boutique firms and everybody in the middle. It's almost been funny how similar their answers are. And I still can't quite figure out if that's the real reason. Like, are customers just saying, hey, don't worry about that stuff. We'll figure it out. You guys just worry about getting SAP implemented and then we'll take it.
Yeah. Oh, I appreciate this conversation more than you know. And I don't know. Like you're right. You're absolutely right when people talk about failed adoption rates and like what's the definition of insanity, right? Doing the same
Yes.
thing, getting the same results. So um, it's such an opportunity, and I would venture to say that because of that is so predictable, it's kind of part of the sales strategy. And I don't know if that makes sense of because what happens when these things fail is the timeline gets pushed out, right? So it's almost like
Yes.
they almost plan for some of these things to happen as part of their business models, which is sad, but I do think you've uncovered something else, which is the customer doesn't always believe that they need that to invest that much in
Yes.
that part, right? So it's almost like they have to prove it that way. So
Yes.
this could make a great podcast.
Yeah. I think it would be like maybe I can do like a little, reels or shorts or whatever it is. It would be funny to just walk up to the SIs and even some customers that are hiring these folks and say, tell me why you didn't ask the SI to play a role in ultimately the success of the project. Um it's a shame that I think this goes back to something you and I talked about in preparation for today, that I think the frontline team members often end up being the victims of this digital transformation. They weren't there. They didn't have a seat at the table. They didn't get to choose how this change was going to be imposed on them. They didn't get to choose that they're going to opt out of having a little additional time, and yet they now have to absorb all that. I think the thing that I am curious about, and I'd like to kind of get your take on this, is how, because in the end, the operations pays for this. It's just, do you pay for it proactively with less disruption to the business? Or do you pay for it after the fact when things don't go so well? You now have disruption and you pay the price through employee attrition, potentially customer attrition, or at least a decline in customer satisfaction. And then the actual hard costs of having to remediate the situation that's not going right. How can we actually shift leaders' thinking or have, what can they do to get a better grip on this in advance so that they don't have to wait until after to feel this pain, right? So that we can maybe shift it to being proactive versus reactive.
Yeah, well, honestly, like, we're trying to change the culture, right, of how people feel about this and what are they gonna do differently, so I do think there's this element of, education that needs to happen, right, and I think one of the strongest questions that you can ask a leader as you're preparing for a change and as a change practitioner, what are the ramifications if this doesn't happen? Right? So you ask them, what are they trying to do? What are they trying to solve? But what will happen if we don't do this right? And I think that is a very powerful question because it gets them thinking about doing things the right way in advance. And I think if you can prove that with data of showing them percentage of adoptions, history of failed efforts, you've got a compelling business case, and you've got to speak their language when you do it. So um, whenever you want somebody to make a behavioral change, you have to really pull on either their heartstrings or their purse strings or both. And I think that there's a real opportunity here to help educate and understand because they've got a vested stake and interest in this being successful. Their name is on it, right?
Yes. Yeah. When you ask that question, if you were to come back and they were to say, well, it would be catastrophic, our NPS score would go down, customer sat, whatever the metric is that they're driving
Yeah.
to. Okay. So failure is not an option. So here's what we propose. This is executive. This is what we are saying is the right way to go about this. You need to grant people the time in the field to absorb this change. Like we should probably start talking about it now. Oh, but Julie, the project's not going to be deployed for 2 years. Yeah, but we should probably start talking, maybe not 2 years out, but a couple of quarters out, we ought to start prepping the field for the change that's going to take place. And then they come back and say, well, we can't afford to do all of the things that you're saying right now. So if that's the right way, then we can't do it that way. Would the advice be, then you should not do this project?
I guess I'm thinking someplace in the middle. Like we're talking two polar opposites, and I'm like, why not meet them in the middle? Um, if it were my project, I would break it down by the different change impacts of the types of changes that need to happen and prioritize them. And say, well, then let's just focus around the three. So is it a belief change? Is it a change in mindset? Is it a change in job role? Like you can break those down and figure out a percentage of how the employee needs to work differently. What does that mean? And then I think again that helps you make the business case for okay, I know we can't boil the ocean, do all of these, but these are the top three. Let's focus on these. So I think it gives us opportunity to have a little bit more flexibility in the approach.
I think that's a good way to think about it because at least then if we could pick off the 20% or whatever of things that we could do that might have an 80% impact, um, we could at least put this thing, on the right trajectory.
Yes.
Yeah. So tell me more about your book. Let's talk about your book, your practice. Like, let's just get into it. We have an opportunity to kind of promote some of the things that you're doing here. So let's do that. So tell me what an ideal customer engagement looks like for you, and then kind of what made it. I'm going to ask you two questions in one here. What motivated you to write the book, and what you're hoping to accomplish with that?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for asking and for having me. Honestly, in my experience that I've had and the changes that I've been a part of and or led a team doing, I noticed a lot of commonalities, and I've seen things happen well, and seen things stall and not happen well at all. So it really is grounded in a lot of experience. And as a change practitioner, I like to look at all these different methodologies and frameworks. I believe that there's not a one size fits all. There's some things that some frameworks do really great, and I know some are more widely known, but I really believe that it's bigger than just a framework or methodology, to be honest with you. And so that's why I've kind of comically labeled it the people stack to go along with a tech stack. And we talked a little bit earlier about that 5-layer invisible human operating system and the trust being foundational at every level. So the first part of the book really talks about each of those layers and some of the things that I've seen that are signals or signs that things might not be going so well, and what is needed to kind of create and be successful in that layer, and what does trust look like in each of the layers. The second part of the book focuses kind of on the leader activation of the people stack. So it talks a lot about resistance, which I know you and I talked about the last time we spoke quite a bit. So I've kind of updated that a little bit to talk about not only resistance archetypes, so how people present themselves during change, but the drivers underneath those and the prescriptions of what to do with all of that. Because a lot of times people will talk about resistance, they see it, but then they're like, now what do I do with this? And then from there, I talk a little bit about this thing that I call confidence and the confident leader, which is kind of a phrase that I've coined of what do people need during times of uncertainty or while they're leading through change. And they really need this steady presence, this leader that has a pause and that will listen, that they'll be active and visible. And they've got this perspective of, not knowing all the answers or not knowing all the factors, but being able to kind of be present, listen, and then move the organization forward in the way that it needs to be. And that ties a lot to that belief layer that we were talking about because they're going to have this affinity or following if they're doing this right. And there's a model.
Can you spell confidence, please? Because I know what you're saying, but just so that everybody can hear.
Yes, it's a combination of calm and confidence. So it's confidence is CALM and then fidence. Okay,
Okay.
confidence.
Okay.
I gave a presentation on it earlier this week. So what was I saying? So back to the how do you activate this confidence is through this ACT model of acknowledging, of communicating, clarifying, and translating that. So again, as you're listening to people, you and mostly people with resistance, you might not always agree, but you validate that you heard and understand them, and then this is what we're going to do with it. And then I talk a little bit about leading change through AI because that's such a hot topic and how to apply these things, and give some kind of just tips about how to move forward with all of this. So it was a lot once I kind of figured out how I had been applying things and kind of backwards and reverse engineered rather. Um, what I really wanted to help people understand that it's bigger than just a framework or methodology, even a process. It's kind of this human operating system, and then, well, how do we do that?
Yeah, that's amazing. So what does a great customer opportunity look like for you to bring your years of experience to help organizations through change like this?
Yeah, so I'm looking for people that need help with this. It's certainly a passion of mine. It's not easy. We talked about this the whole episode, right? Of the challenges, and I really am very focused on helping to do change management because it's the right thing to do for our people, but to drive adoption, because I know that there are investments that are being made. So I'm open to all different types of industries. Luckily, I've had experience in many, and I do think that this translates across many, that the people are people, right? And there are industry nuances, which is good, but I do think, when you think about change management, it's something that it's broadly applicable. So I do workshops and facilitations, but I also do advising on projects, and then I work with other consultants, and we come together and do large projects. So I do have some flexibility with some of the services that I offer.
That's excellent. I don't I wonder, and if this is not something that's part of your engagement methodology today, I wonder if it would ever make sense. But it feels to me like the work that you do needs to get done, whether it's done proactively or after the fact. It goes back to the can of worms. Can of worms are going to get opened. It's a matter of, are they going to get opened before, where we can plan and organize, or is it going to happen after? And I wonder if the case for your services and services like yours and just the investment in the strategy overall is some way to lay out perhaps some examples of, like, here's an example of a project that was done well. Yes, there was some upfront cost, and here's what that cost was, and here's where the kind of line items of investment went into this. Here's an example of a very similar project where those investments weren't made up front. And so here's where the cost materialized after. Like we've said, and I've seen this and said this 100 times before, that the most difficult leaders to sell on these ideas are the ones who maybe haven't been through a change as transformational as what is ahead of them. And so I think it's easy to get comforted in the lack of knowledge, naivete, or whatever. I hate to say naivete; that it makes it sound like they're unknowing, but it's maybe they just haven't experienced that type of difficulty. But to what you said, to speak in their language, like, here's the business case, here's the investment before, here's the potential cost after. It's cheaper, it's faster, there'll be
Yeah.
less stress in the business, less stress in your customers. Like, yes, there's an upfront cost, but it's going to be better than all of the other alternatives.
Percent. And it's funny because I've been toying with kind of what's next after I release the book. And, I do want to build a people stack diagnostic. And I do think that um, cost and investment needs to be a piece of that. So you've just given me a ton of new ideas, Justin.
Yeah, yeah. Well, I think we just have to bring it down to, again, you said this better than I think I've heard anybody else say here. We've got to speak to leaders in their language in a way that makes sense for them. Um, and it's kind of like the difference between, we've talked about this on my team a lot. It's like fitness and healthcare, or like emergency care versus taking care of for longevity, are
Yeah.
two different things. Like, when you break your leg, you don't have a lot of decisions. You're just going to go and you're going to get your bone fixed, right?
Uh,
But there are so many things that we can be doing in advance that actually cost less or less traumatic on our health, physically and mentally, and all that. It kind of feels like it's the same thing. Like, you're always going to find the money to spend when you just try to implement Salesforce, and everything's in chaos now. And
yeah.
so you're going to have to find the money then, right? To go repair your broken leg. It's a lot easier to stay fit in advance. So, all right, we are up at the end of our time. What is one last? You've already dropped at least a dozen amazing nuggets for our guest today, or for our audience. But what's one last piece of advice that you would give to anybody listening today about how to perhaps connect better to the senior level stakeholders in the business, and help them understand that the cost of poor adoption?
Yeah, I think it's really understanding who they are as a leader and how they show up and what drives them and what are they passionate about. What are they worried about? Because I think if you can understand those pieces, it can help you formulate a good solution to help them, to help, whether it's help educate them, help bring them along, help support them. It's kind of like doing a stakeholder assessment, but on an individual. And the more that they'll let you in, the more information you have, the better solution you can have to support them.
That's awesome. Julie, thank you so much. We're going to link to your LinkedIn profile. And if it's ready in time, we will have a link to your book on Amazon, which, if I understand correctly, is going to be available in paperback and on Kindle. And so we'd be happy to include that in the show notes when everything drops.
Thank you so much for having me.
Excellent.
Thanks for listening to Frontline Innovators. If you enjoyed today's conversation, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss future episodes. And remember, when we put people at the center of digital transformation, frontline workers thrive and organizations succeed. This podcast is brought to you by Skillful, helping frontline teams adopt the technology they need to work smarter, safer, and with confidence.